Welcome to the afternoon session of Ask Larry. Had to shift this to 1 o'clock, which was an unusual time, I'm sure, for most of you. I had a doctor's appointment this morning, just my normal checkup, and the doctor said he's going to keep me around for another 20, 30 years. So blood pressure was 110/70, which is not bad for an old guy. We'll know the rest of the test later, but always comes back the same thing, you know, don't eat so much, put on weight, but I blame that on COVID. So I'm getting my mileage out of COVID. Couple things here. Remember, starting tomorrow, the transfer tax will be $50 per 100,000 more for your seller. One of the tax law changes. The other change to that transfer tax is it is a negotiable item now between buyer and seller. So if your buyer is looking for extra little thing that they can give away when they're in a competition for a property, they can offer to pay the transfer tax or part of it now. The other thing that anytime they get all these new programs, somebody's got to pay for them. So fill your car up with gas today, because starting tomorrow, there's adding a 7.6% tax to it. So be 8 cents a gallon more starting tomorrow. So when you see the jump at the pump, you know it wasn't because the price of gas went up, the price of taxes went up again. So one other thing, one call I got, can I give money back? Can I give money to someone who refers business to me? The answer, and they wanted to know if I was against the code of ethics. It's not against the code of ethics, but it is against the law in the state of Virginia. You can't give anyone who is not licensed a referral fee for sending you business. It's against the law for them to accept it. It's against the law for you to give it to someone. You can give money back to your client, the buyer or seller, in a transaction that you are involved in with them, not because they were your buyer and seller prior and you want to give them some money back for other people they send to you. So the way the law states, not even a candy bar. So be careful when you want to try to get money back. One exception to the law: if you live in an apartment complex, the apartment complex can offer $50 to their own tenants for referring another tenant, but that's an exception. So don't get caught in trying to give money back. So what we've decided to do here today, and we're going to do another session Thursday at 11, is all the information we went through, form changes last week. We're going to slow down. I'm going to back up, take financing stuff today, the other on Thursday. So if you have your package of materials that were sent to you last week, I am going to start with the residential sales contract. It is Form K-1321. In that package, it was page 68 that they had numbered for you. So sales contract, when it comes to financing, we're just going to work our way through this. If you've located the form, and we are working on getting Dropbox, we have Dropbox. They're going to try to teach me how to use it so I could pull the form up for you. But for today, price and financing, paragraph 2. I wanted to discuss this paragraph. They've added any percentages or percentages of sales price. So you can literally use the percentages, which I think most people do. I'm old school. I like the numbers so my people can actually see the numbers. One of the problems we run into with filling this paragraph out is making sure everything adds up. So I'm just going to throw out a little transaction here for you. $200,000 sales price. That goes at the bottom where it says sales price, $200,000. I want to do an 80-10-10 transaction, 80-10-10. So the down payment would be 10%. Then financing first trust would be 80%, and you'll notice that that's where they move conventional, VA, FHA, USDA, or other form of finance. That used to be a separate paragraph, okay? That would be 80. Second trust would be 10%, and seller held would be 0. I do not like to see any blanks in a sales contract. 0 or not applicable. Don't leave anything blank. When I do this in my classes, then I ask, what's the total financing? And I hear 80, 90, and 100. But I mean, it's 80 and 10 is 90%. The other 10% is the down payment. So if you put 100%, then we've got 110% of sales price. That doesn't work. That's why I prefer the numbers. I realize math is challenging to some people, but if you have trouble with it, just keep your lender at bay and answer your phone call. But the down payment would be $20,000. First trust would be $160,000. Second trust would be $20,000. Seller held would be 0. Total financing would be $180,000. Here's a little tip. If you add down payment to total financing and it does not equal sales price, please start over. Okay, those numbers have to equal. Now, seller subsidy. This used to be in your financing contingencies. They have moved seller subsidy to the first page to give the seller a true idea of what their net price is. You notice that seller subsidy is capitalized. You may remember from hearing me talk about contracts in the past. When a word is capitalized in the sales contract, that means there is a written definition that buyer and seller have agreed to. So seller subsidy is defined in our sales contract. If you will go to paragraph 31 of your sales contract, and hopefully you have it there in front of you. On page 18, you will see J, seller subsidy. Is a payment from seller towards buyer's charges, including but not limited to loan origination fees, discount points, buy down or subsidy fees, prepaids or other charges as allowed by the lenders. And that's the key word there, folks, as allowed by the lenders, if any. It is the buyer's responsibility to confirm with any lender or lenders that the entire credit provided herein may be utilized. If lender prohibits seller from the payment of any portion of this credit, then said credit shall be reduced to the amount allowed by the lenders. So most of your programs, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Ginnie Mae, 5% or 10% down allow a maximum of 3%, okay? 3% of closing costs. And in Virginia, closing costs run about 2.88%. Make sure that your buyer can use all 3%. Don't ask for something they can't use, because if it can't be used, that money goes back to the seller. And I'm dumbfounded by the number of agents out there who think any money not used is given to the buyer, you know, as a credit somewhere else on the sheet, or just money to them. And that's against the law. Okay? So if you can't use it all, then don't ask for it. But seller subsidy is defined, okay? Check with your lender to make sure they can use it all up. A problem that I'm starting to see arise is that if there's a home inspection contingency, and in lieu of doing all the work, the seller will give a credit to the buyer of 2% of the sales price, okay? You've already asked for 3% in seller subsidy, which is the max they can use, and now you're negotiating 2% additional for your home inspection towards closing costs. Now we have 5%. The lender only allows 3% of it to be used. Then you basically have given away all the repairs that your buyer was going to get done on their property, because they're going to have to take the money out of their pocket at the table to pay for something somewhere. So be careful with the seller subsidy. The reason they added the word less is seller subsidy is not added. It is subtracted from the price of the property. So if there were 3% closing cost on the $200,000, that's $6,000. That is, basically a $294,000 sales price to the seller minus their other cost. If you have any questions about any of this, yell out. And it's questions about the financing. I'll answer Ask Larry questions on other subjects at the end of this session. Back to page 8, paragraph 2 of the sales contract. Financing contingency and application. The contract is or is not contingent on financing. If it's VA and FHA, Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, they're contingent. If this contract is contingent on financing, buyer will make written application for the financing and any lender required property insurance no later than 7 days after date of ratification. Your buyer actually has to go to to an insurance company and get a quote so that the lender can factor it in as to whether or not they qualify for the mortgage still. And be aware that how much my insurance cost me is not determined by how good I've been about using insurance, but a lot of it's the claims on the property that the previous owner had made, and also is it in a floodplain? Is it in a floodplain? So we had a question about applications and stuff last week. So you'll notice the word application is not capitalized. That's because the definition of what an application for a mortgage is defined under Truth in Lending, RESPA Integrated Disclosure Act. So here's what's necessary for a valid application under TRID. These 6 items: the purchaser's name, their income, social security number, a property address, which how can we have a property address unless we have a contract? Estimated value of the property, which would be the sales price, and the mortgage loan amount. Until the lender has all 6 of those items, there is not an application for a loan, okay? Once they do have all 6 pieces of that information, then there is a loan application. Then once they take that from the buyer, they have 3 days to get out the loan estimate to your buyer. If your buyer receives a loan estimate from the lender, then they have made a written or oral application. So an application for a loan can be in writing or oral. Our contract calls for it to be in writing to start the time, okay? But if your buyer gives the lender all that information over the phone, and there is a property and it's followed up by a written communication, that gets us started, okay? So we're talking probably can't make the written application until we have a contract. That's why the buyer has 7 days from the date of ratification to apply for their loan. Buyer grants permission of co-op broker and lender to disclose to listing broker and seller general information about the progress of the loan application and process, but they don't have to. If they want to, they can give you the information. They did remove from this paragraph the default requirement. If you didn't get your application and all that stuff in, that has been removed because it's already contained somewhere else in our contract. Okay, so whatever your buyer puts in those terms is what they have to do. I want you to now find page 69 in that handout from last week, conventional financing and appraisal contingency addendum. And they do put in these emails where you find these different forms. So you can download them right from the site or from that email. The conventional financing addendum. I'm just going to go through this addendum, not just the changes, okay? So that we all on the same page. Specified financing, once again, those capital letters in quotation marks means there is a written definition, and it is being done here. Means the terms set forth in paragraphs 2A and 2B of this contract in the following terms. So whatever your buyer puts in paragraph 2 of this contract, okay, they must do. If they get turned down for their loan for any term other than what's in there, then they're going to be in default unless the terms were better. So if they said they were going to put 10% down, they got turned down with a 20% down payment, that's not going to be a default. But if they put 20% and only had 10 and they get turned down, now it's going to be a default. Okay. First trust. So the following loan terms: buyer will obtain a first deed of trust loan amortized over 15 or 30 years. The interest rate for this loan is at an initial interest rate not to exceed X% per year. So let's say you put 4%. If the rate goes up above 4%, would your buyer be in default? Maybe. Are they out of the contract if it goes above 4%? No. Okay, not necessarily. And the reason being, go to paragraph 2, alternative financing. This financing contingency shall not apply to any alternative financing. Alternative financing means any change to the financing terms in the specified financing, including but not limited to down payment amount, amount financed, loan type, term of any loan, interest rate, or loan program. So if you put 4% in there, the rate goes up to 4.5%, and they get turned down for their mortgage, then they're going to be in default because that is alternative financing, and the protection of the financing contingency does not continue on if you have alternative financing. So they need to get turned down for exactly what they said they were going to do. Now, buyer may substitute alternative financing for the specified, so they can change. However, if you're going to change loan programs or any of those figures, you need to get the seller's written consent and execute a new financing addendum if applicable. So you're changing from conventional to FHA. The seller has to agree to that. And you'll see why when you look at the different contingencies for financing, because different programs have different requirements. If the seller says, no, I don't agree to that FHA, then they're going to have to get turned down for their conventional loan, and the contract will probably die at that point. Okay? Should buyer pursue alternative financing without the seller's written consent? So you get the seller's written consent. Now, that is the new specified financing that you're working towards. If you don't, we're still dealing with the old terms. So if they went from conventional to FHA and they get turned down for an FHA loan and the seller did not agree, your buyer is going to be in default and suffer financial consequences. Okay?
So the specified financing, where if you have to put the request, do you have to do it within 7 days, and that will not fall under alternative financing, right? And the seller has to agree that instead of,
if you're going to change anything in paragraph 2, then the seller has to agree. If you get turned down for your loan for something other than paragraph 2, your purchaser is going to be in default if the other agent knows what they're doing. If somebody sends over something, a rejection of the loan to me, it's going to have to come from the underwriter, and it's going to have to specify the terms in paragraph 2A and B. If it's anything else, I'm going to advise my seller that they talk to an attorney, because they've gone outside to alternative financing and they lost the protection of this contingency.
okay.
So it goes on to say, and this was the question that was asked last week: buyer's substitution of lenders to which written application has been made under paragraph 2D of this contract shall not A, constitute a change in specified financing or constitute buyer default, provided there's no additional expense to the seller and settlement date is not delayed. They do not need permission to change the lender. Now, it says written application. When we look back at the definition of written application, of an application for a mortgage under TRID, okay, those 6 items have to be given. So if your buyer made an application and they got the loan estimate was given to them before contract ratification, then that's probably going to be the lender that you're talking about. But most lenders can't do that until you actually have a contract. So if you look back at paragraph 2 of your sales contract 2D, it says I have 7 days to make that written application for my loan. So if your buyer hasn't had the loan estimate sent to them, then there was no application under TRID statute. Okay, so the letter I send with my contract, the way I read the contract as a strict constructionist, is not necessarily who the lender's going to be. That's just telling us by what they see. It could be, they should be qualified. But there's very seldom anything in there as far as a written commitment with that letter that you get with a contract. Okay, so, or application. So my opinion would be, if we switch off from the person at the letter that accompanied the contract to somebody else in that 7-day period, that is now the lender in that 7-day period. And if my person wants to change after that time period, they would lose the protection under the contract if they don't settle on the same day it's supposed to. No additional expense to the seller. Does that make sense?
Hey, Larry.
Yes.
I have a question I have 2 questions regarding that, the specified lending, financing, sorry. So my understanding is that if they write 3% and they get a higher rate and they're no longer qualified for the higher percentage, they're in default, right, at that point, unless they go back to ask for a different loan type, like
Correct.
an FHA or VA.
Correct.
That is my understanding. Okay.
Yes.
So
now, if the seller agrees in writing, then we have new specified financing because the seller agreed to it in writing.
got it. But so let's say that didn't happen. The seller didn't agree. They're a default. They don't qualify at the higher rate. Does that mean now the earnest money deposit is in jeopardy?
Yes, it does, as well as other expenses of the contract.
Like legal fees?
Yeah, if paragraph 28 of the contract covers default, and it can be even the commissions that were involved. So paragraph 28 is
Okay.
quite extensive in damages. And what we'll do is I'll make a note. We'll take a look at paragraph 28 on Thursday. Okay. If I forget, remind me, but let me write myself a note right now. Look at paragraph 28 on Thursday. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Now, they've added a paragraph 3 and 4 to the conventional financing addendum. Okay. Paragraph 3 is the old paragraph that we had before, and it deals with the written approval from the lender. This contract is contingent on buyer delivering to seller, and once again, capital letter D. After we get through all this new form stuff, I'll do a basic sales contract class one day, especially for newer people, so you know how to read this contract. Days after date of ratification, written conditional commitments for specified financing. Now you notice the word conditional commitments in writing is not capitalized. It can be almost anything that says written conditional commitment, but it's for specified financing, not any alternative financing. Unless buyer and seller have agreed in writing, then that is the specified financing. So that's the importance of understanding the capital S and the capital F there. If the buyer has not delivered the written conditional commitment by financing deadline, then the contingency continues up to and including settlement date. And all contingency ends at 9 p.m. on the day of settlement contingencies. The contract actually dies at midnight on the day of settlement if you don't settle, but contingencies end at 9 p.m. because that's what we've agreed to in writing in the contract. Okay? Now, however, upon expiration of the financing deadline, now if you follow TRID guidelines, I see people put 14 days or 21 days. I use 30 days at a minimum just for following TRID guidelines. But generally, when it's a multi-contract presentation, it's one of the first things that gets changed. Then it's pretty tough for a lender who gets the written application within 7 days after the contract ratification, and then they have 3 days to give the loan estimate, and the buyer has 10 days to give intent to proceed before they can even get appraisal fees or what. You can see where it's going to take some time. We're figuring out ways to try to work our way around TRID. I don't recommend we do that, but I understand multi-contract presentations. Sometimes you have to give some things away. And that's why they came up with a new paragraph 4 that we'll take a look at. However, if the seller has not received that written application, that written conditional commitment, then the buyer has 3 days to void the contract after they receive that written notice. There is a form, a written notice form for the seller to give to the buyer that they have 3 days. And it's not to prove they can get the loan. That's old school. It's 3 days to either void their contract or they move forward without a financing contingency. That is the reason that I never put my name in paragraph 6 of the sales contract where things would be delivered to me, because if it's delivered to the agent, you can't reach that buyer. You don't have the power to void their contract. They're going to lose their financing protection unless you can reach them in that time period. So be very careful how you insert yourself into these sales contracts, okay? So if the buyer does not void the contract and there is a notice to void the contract, right? You don't send over a release, you have to send a notice. Within 3 days following delivery of the seller's notice, financing contingency removed and the contract remained in full force and effect. No financing contingency, right? Now your buyer better settle on the day they're supposed to, or there's going to be a default. Now, as always, the buyer can void the contract by delivering the seller prior to satisfaction or removal of this contingency, a written rejection from the lenders to whom buyer has applied. And once again, there's that specified financing, capital S, capital F, whatever's in 2A and 2B of the contract and paragraph 1 and 2 of the addendum form. And there's nothing herein shall prohibit the parties from mutually agreeing to terms acceptable to both parties in writing, which when the question was asked, yes, they could go to VA, everybody agrees. Simple algebra will tell you if you change the left side of the equation, you need to change the right side of the equation. So if you're going to have different financing, different lenders, you need to change your settlement date, okay? Because paragraph 28 simply says, if the buyer fails to settle for any reason other than a default by the seller, that buyer will be in default, okay? And it doesn't matter that, you forgot to change that other paragraph. Make sure you change settlement date when you change financing. Now, second page of this conventional financing addendum, we see the new 4. This was added, okay? This contract is contingent on the buyer delivering to the seller by 9 p.m. X number of days. Says the same thing, the written commitments. But this is with an automatic expiration, okay? The other was with automatic extension unless the seller had sent notice. The seller doesn't have to send notice on this one. If you put 14 or 21 days for the financing, that contingency automatically ends in that number of days, okay? If the buyer has not delivered the written conditional commitment, contingency will expire. They have to settle or be in default. The buyer may void by delivering the seller prior to satisfaction or expiration of a written rejection from the lender. It's hard to get a written rejection from the lender and prove that they have done what they were supposed to reject the loan in 14 to 21 days. Be very careful how you use paragraph 4. So if you're the listing agent and there's multiple offers, or if you're just a listing agent, period, which paragraph would you probably prefer used? 3 or 4 as the listing agent? I would think probably 4. Okay, let's get it over with. But if I'm the buyer's agent, my recommendation to the buyer is they need to use paragraph 3. Okay, don't put yourself in a chance to automatically be losing your financing contingency. Any questions to this point? Good. So let's look at one of the big changes to the forms here, the contract form anyway, that came about July 1st. Okay, and understand this doesn't go into effect until tomorrow. Okay, so if you write a contract today and it gets ratified, you're probably using the prior contract. So this term here does not begin the appraisal contingency until tomorrow. So tomorrow, if you're writing a contract, this form should be available for you to use. Appraisal contingency. Contract is or is not contingent upon an appraisal pursuant to this paragraph. Buyer shall have until 9 p.m., minimum 21 days. You have to understand the lender can't even get the appraisal fee from the buyer until there's a loan estimate from a loan application and the buyer has given intent to proceed. Up to that point, the only fee the lender can receive is a credit check fee. Don't back a party into a corner here. But also understand, if you don't check one of those 2 boxes, then it defaults to the financing deadline. Okay, so if you had 21 days for financing and you didn't put anything in this paragraph, then it's 21 days here also. Now they've made a change here. Buyer shall deliver notice to seller, and it's a notice. A notice is only signed by one party. Okay. Addendum forms. When there's an addendum form, a broker doesn't have to sign an addendum except for the FHA financing addendum, okay? And the lead-based paint disclosure. That's the only thing agents ever have to sign in a contract unless they're one of the buyers or sellers. So don't submit forms to the broker and say it requires your signature on the bottom of this. If it did, there would be a place for the broker to sign. And it's the only 2 forms out there that's necessary. Okay. Now, they've come out with a new appraisal contingency form. You have it there in that package. I'll give you the form number. Okay. It is form number K1349. It would be on page 72, and it looks like this. Okay. This is a new form that you would now use with this contract to remove the appraisal contingency. I get the question probably 50 times a year. Once the financing contingency has been removed, did that remove the appraisal contingency? No, they are 2 different contingencies. They're on the same form, but they're 2 different contingencies. So I guess that's why the forms committee finally decided, let's do an appraisal contingency notice. Okay, so the buyer has to deliver the notice to the seller by the appraisal deadline. This is the notice reflecting what it says in the appraisal contingency paragraph. Before we go through each one of those so you understand them, what happens if the buyer does not deliver the appraisal contingency notice by the appraisal deadline? Well, it's just like financing. It continues on until settlement date, okay? But once this contingency ends, so we had 21 days to do this appraisal contingency. Well, on page 71, it says, if the buyer does not void, if the buyer doesn't deliver this appraisal contingency notice, okay, then by the deadline, this continues up until settlement date. However, if you had 21 days and the seller sends a notice to the buyer that they have not received the appraisal, then the 3 days to void is the same as in the finance contingency. And if they didn't void, the appraisal contingency is removed. If the appraisal comes in low then, after the receipt of that notice, then your buyer will have to make up the difference and go to the table because otherwise they would be in default. So delivery of that notice or not delivering the notice, it's the same as the financing now, okay? Now, let's take a look at the options under the appraisal contingency, okay? Equal to or greater than the sales price, contingency is satisfied and removed. What you have to understand, there is not an appraisal when the appraiser sends it to the lender. It becomes an appraisal after the staff underwriter for appraisals at the lender has accepted it. So just because the dollar amount came in the eyes of that appraiser, the staff review appraiser could say, I don't like that appraisal, it doesn't look right. They could lower the amount, they could raise the amount. There's all kinds of things that could happen. Buyer elects to proceed, paragraph B, with consummation of this contract or without regard to the appraisal, and this contingency is removed. So even if it comes in low, we're going to take it, right? However, look at option C. The appraisal is equal to or greater than the sales price, but buyer elects not to proceed with consummation of this contract because property 1 does not satisfy lender's requirements, and that's that staff underwriter. The appraisal does not allow for the specified financing, or the property is inadequate collateral. So it comes back and the lender's told that they need all these extra repairs and everything, then they might consider that inadequate collateral. So if they get something from the lender that says, yes, the price was okay, however, we're not making a loan for one of these reasons, then as soon as they get that appraisal contingency notice accompanied by the written denial, so you would send this form with the written denial and check that box. Now on this appraisal contingency notice form, you can only check one box. If there's multiple boxes checked, then the notice is void and no force in effect. So there's only one appropriate choice. Now, here's what they really added to the appraisal contingency. It's just like a home inspection contingency form. If this appraisal is less than the sales price, buyer elects not to proceed with consummation of the contract unless seller elects to lower the sales price. Buyer's appraisal contingency notice shall include a copy of the written statement setting forth the appraised value of the property and buyer's proposed sales price, which shall not be lower than the appraised value. So with a conventional contract, if the seller is willing to lower the price down to the appraisal price, then we have a transaction. So if you look at the appraisal contingency notice, go to the last choice, seller elects to lower the sales price to, it cannot be lower than the appraised value. But what if the seller says, look, rather than us appeal and do all this other stuff, we're 10,000 off. You give us 195 instead of the 190. You pay the additional 5,000. We have a deal. So you can use that blank on the appraisal contingency to offer more than the appraised price, but less than the sales price. Or everybody agrees that it will now be the appraised value. Okay. Now, if the appraisal comes in low, we now have that negotiation period. Okay. The negotiation period. So, in the event of this subparagraph 5D, the party shall have until 9 p.m. X number of days after buyer's delivery of the appraisal contingency notice to negotiate a mutually acceptable new sales price. If you put 3 days, okay, first day begins the day after delivery. In that 3-day period at 9 p.m., if you do not have a written agreement between all parties that is delivered, this contingency is over. Okay. What if we continue to negotiate past this negotiating period? Okay. And we get into buyer's election period and we come up with a written agreement. Well, as long as everybody goes to settlement and agrees to that, it's not a problem. But what if one of the parties says, you know what, we went past that negotiating period, and you know, this, and you didn't give notice, buyer, so that means nothing, and we have to go to the table. An arresting question for a judge, but I'm going to give you my opinion here as we look at the rest of the negotiating period. And I approach this as a strict constructionist. What is written is what they mean. Okay? So, at any time during the negotiating period, buyer or seller may make, modify, rescind, or alter as many offers and counteroffers as desired to reach mutually acceptable terms. Buyer and seller may agree on terms by signing a written addendum describing the agreed upon new sales price within the negotiating period. 9 p.m., the negotiating period is over. Now, I maintained this all along when it came to our home inspection contingency removal, and people said, well, we don't agree with that. I said, okay, but I think I'm right. So they added these terms to the negotiating period. Last sentence, otherwise, all offers and counteroffers terminate. It's over. Okay? 9 p.m., no written addendum, then all counteroffers and offers terminate. We are now in paragraph C. If at the end of the negotiating period the parties are unable to reach an agreement, buyer shall have the option to void this contract by delivering notice to seller by 9 p.m. X number of days following the end of the negotiating period. Otherwise, the appraisal contingency is removed. We're in full force and effect. So even though they agreed to something, okay, it may not be enforceable if it ended up in court. Don't take the chance. If you're getting towards the end of your negotiating period, I don't care if it's for your appraisal or home inspection, and you can't make the deadline, get everybody to agree in writing with a written addendum to extend the negotiating period. Extend the negotiating period before the expiration. Okay? So that is what we're looking at when it comes to the appraisal versus the financing. Two different actions, two different parts of the contract. Okay. Now, there's another appraisal contingency form that they've come up with. If it is a cash transaction and your buyer still wants it contingent upon the appraisal to make sure they're not doing something they shouldn't. For years, I've watched people take the conventional financing appraisal contingency addendum and try to use it to make it work for an appraisal. Be careful with that, right? They have this appraisal contingency form now where once the appraisal is done, contract is contingent upon a professional appraisal, and this is Form K-1353, would have been page 73 in your package. conducted by a Virginia licensed appraiser, have until 9 p.m. X number of days to deliver a notice that one of the same choices, okay? And if the buyer hasn't delivered this notice, then it's over. But different appraisal contingency notice to be used for a cash transaction where they are looking for that, okay? Any questions about any of that?
Yes, Larry. This is Maribel.
Huh?
This is Maribel. I have a question about the timeline for the home inspection. When we are in negotiation period, the deadline is 9 p.m., yeah? The day of the
Correct.
contract is
Correct.
specified. I have a case that need to close today, and we are, I think in the previous class, I asked you the listing, and the listing agent, the buyer agent sent me the addendum without the report, okay? My client agreed to do, I never asked for the report, my client agreed to do some items, they changed, I think it may be 2, and then I got back the papers to the listing agent. And then at the end of the negotiation period, she sent me an email saying, I'm gonna send later the papers. She sent me the paper, the deadline at 11:12 p.m. And she asking today, that is the closing day, for the seller pay $4,000 for closing costs. I say no. First of all, you send the report 2 weeks after. Second, you send the page sign for the buyer after the 9 p.m. with the seller help the buyer to repair a lot of, I think it may be 99% of the items that they requesting, but right now they don't gonna give you your client 4,000. And she say, no, they're not gonna close, because I say no, because I have the email that you sent at 11:12. And okay?
Yes. Yes. The buyer, if the buyer doesn't settle, they're going to be in default. But now you're going to have to they're going to have to get an attorney involved.
Okay.
But,
Okay.
But you know, I mean, the forms are very specific. You know, you can't miss times and deadlines. Okay. So I think you're right.
Yeah, I have the email to prove that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the title
I mean,
company.
just tell them to read the contract. You know.
Yeah.
All negotiations end at that period, and then you know.
I explained her about the, over the phone, but she sent a text message. Says, okay, we put a deadline. If we don't say the phone agreed to pay, the seller agreed to pay 4,000. I never respond, because the seller say no, I don't want to pay 4,000. And second,
Yes.
the title company called me, the processor of the title company, and the negotiator is not the title company. I'm gonna call the title company, because it's not the title company negotiator. You know, the negotiation is between realtors, and I'm gonna put a complaint with the title company. Why the title company is gonna call me? And the title company called my client and asked my client to, there are a problem. The title company never need to call my client.
It did, and that charge has to be added by the lender, not by the title company anyway.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Now I want to point out a couple other things on a couple of these financing contingency forms. The FHA financing contingency form, K1340, page 78, 79, etc. of your package. The reason that your buyer can't just switch from one to the other. So page 78 of this is pretty much the same. If you go to page 79, hold on. Hold on, let me see if I can mute this party. Okay, if you go to page 79 of that package, or paragraph 5 of the FHA financing addendum, we have appraisal contingency procedures at the bottom. Upon receipt of the written statement setting forth the appraised value, buyer shall deliver notice to seller. So under FHA, there is no loan until there's an actual written statement showing the value of the property. okay, from the lender. It's not, so we don't have 21, even though it says 21 days, without that from the lender, there's no way that they could force this contract to go forward. So if you look at page 81, the negotiating buyer right to void under FHA looks entirely different than the conventional one where we go back and forth and there's time periods. In the event of this subparagraph 5B4, the parties may negotiate a mutually acceptable, agreeable sales price. Buyer or seller may make, modify, rescind, counter offers. Buyer and seller may agree on terms by signing a written addendum describing the agreed upon new sales price. Buyer may void this contract by delivering notice to seller on or before the earlier of settlement, or buyer and seller signing a written addendum describing the agreed upon sales price. So there is no 23-day negotiating, whatever. We negotiate until we do one or the other. And under FHA and VA, the purchaser can just say, I don't want the property, okay? Unfortunately for people. There's some other things here. The certification paragraph 8, which you would not have in a conventional loan. Seller, buyer, and brokers hereby certify the terms of this contract to which this addendum is attached are true to the best of their knowledge and belief. So any other agreements entered into between the parties with respect to the purchase and sale of the property has been fully disclosed. So you will notice on page 404, the agents and the brokers sign this form, and that is to acknowledge that you have disclosed everything that's in this contract, okay? Everything that's in the contract, there's no getting money back, no funny things happening at all in this contract, because you will be held liable as the broker and agent if there is. Now, VA has one additional thing in theirs because their appraisal is basically the same as FHA, okay? And that is the termite clause. Under VA, the purchaser cannot pay for the termite. So that is actually included on the VA financing addendum, okay? That's a lot for you in one day when it comes to the financing contingencies, or whatever. Those are the changes that we have in forms that start July 1st. Any questions about any of that? Or any other questions?
Yes,
Any
I have
other
a question.
Okay.
I want to double check when we must use this form. I'm in the middle of contract negotiations right now for a contract written yesterday. I can continue using that, the one we're working with, correct?
You continue with the one you have.
Right,
These
that's
are
what I
just,
thought.
these forms start tomorrow, but you don't have to, you know, use them. I mean, you can stick with the old forms, and if you started with the old, these terms don't start unless you use the new one.
Right,
Absolutely.
that's what I thought. Okay, thanks.
Now the one thing you might be cognizant of, if you do not have a contract on that property by midnight tonight, and you use the old seller disclosure form, I would probably substitute it with the new one that will be out tomorrow. That says, you know, because the disclosures and all changed as of tomorrow, but I don't even know if the form's out until tomorrow. So, but if you're not fully ratified today, I might send over that new form when it's out.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, but the law specifically said if you're under contract, you don't have to send a new one. Right?
Okay.
Any other questions?
Hey, I have one question, Larry. You kept referencing the packet.
Uh-huh.
I've been, in your invite, I just downloaded the various forms or documents.
Okay.
I don't have the packet. I'm wondering if you could send me the packet.
The last week's email had it in there. I'll see if Jocelyn can just, you know, or whoever's doing this can just include the whole package, and we can look at the, you know, different page forms we need, because you're the one downloading them. So we'll get it.
Okay.